such a brilliant and knowledgeable panel, and I'm sure we'll have an interesting debate over the next hour. The Fabian Society has continually made space for debates like this to happen, to challenge ideas and present bold, out-of-the-box alternatives. So if you like what you hear and you're not already a member, please do consider joining and taking part in these future events. You can find out more at fabians.org.uk. Also, we're encouraging people to take part and make their voice heard across social media. So if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag FEPSFAB21, and we do welcome any tweets that encourage further debate on important issues just like this one. And make sure to follow our panelists to follow on their work on Twitter. To begin, we'll be hearing from each of our panelists who have been given 5 minutes to speak. We'll learn more about their ideas and the work they've done. We'll then move on to questions from the floor. These can be submitted via the Q&A function, which you'll see on your screen. Please note that the chat function should be used for comments, and any questions must be put into the Q&A section, and we'll try and get us through as many of them as possible with the time we've been given. Moving on to our panel today. We've joining us is Amanda Martin, Michelle Codrington-Rogers, Barry Black, and Wes Streeting MP. So I'll move on to them, and I see that we'll start with Michelle. Michelle Codrington-Rogers was elected as the first full-time NUS Black Students Officer before training as a teacher of citizenship. She became involved in trade union activity as a member of NASUWT, first as school rep, then as a local secretary, and as Oxfordshire Federation Secretary. Michelle has been elected to the TUC Race Relations Committee since 2011, and she chaired the annual TUC Black Workers Conference in 2018. Michelle was elected as National Officer of the NASUWT Union in 2018 and started her term as National President last year. So I'll ask Michelle to come on and give her 5 minutes opening speech.
And I'm very well trained, so I know when to keep my microphone on and off. So thank you very much, Ava, for that wonderful introduction. I do want to thank the Fabian Society and the Young Scottish Fabians for this invite as well. Well, where do we start? We know that this year has been an absolute nightmare on so many levels for so many people, not least for how many people have lost their lives as a result of a global pandemic. And NASUWT, as a UK-wide union, has been supporting our members not just in England and Wales and Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland and in England. So we have had a wide picture of what's been happening across the country. I think the best way to say is that education has been and is still in a state of siege. I think every teacher wakes up every morning going, what next? What could possibly be thrown at us? And we have to say thank you so much to our colleagues. And because obviously this is hosted by the Scottish Fabians, I do want to say thank you very much to our Scottish colleagues for the amount of work they've put into being able to pivot on the head of a pin. And I think if I would say there was a word that I have kind of adopted during this global pandemic and how it's all been responded to, it's pivot, because our colleagues are pivoting so much to be able to ensure that young people are able to continue their education, that we are in constant state of flux. And what we have to also acknowledge is that so many schools and colleges are just trying to do their best. However, this pandemic and the way that it's been responded to by governments and administration shows how much crisis education was in before. Education was being held together by spit, blue tack and sellotape by our colleagues. And this pandemic has absolutely it's drawn the curtain back and shown what our colleagues are being expected to do. And it's important, I think, from this aspect to kind of take the consideration that the system was broken before. And all of this has been exposed. And now, especially parents are starting to see how much work and the workload that teachers carry to ensure that young people and children are able to achieve their potential. Members of the public are starting to see how crucial education is and how teachers especially are being on their knees to try and support and to prop up this education system. And I know the overall conversation today is going to be around reflecting on how we're surviving. Let's be honest, how we're surviving this year. But I think I'm very much an optimist, and anyone who knows me knows that I try to always find the positive that comes out of it. And for me, we have to be thinking about what do we want education to look like post-pandemic? What did education look like before? And why are we fighting so much to protect an education system that wasn't working for so many children and young people and our teacher colleagues while it was in the kind of in the shape it was then before March 2020, because so much has happened in that time. And we have to think about, what do we want to keep? For example, league tables, do we really need them? Are they something that we need to be putting all of that energy into? But also thinking about school funding and thinking about education needs to be for who? What does education look like, and how is it going to be delivered? Remote learning is not something that's going to go away, but we have to think, how does it work in education while not costing the profession, the teaching profession, or most importantly, human relationships? We need to, and I like the phrase building back better, because our education needs to reflect what we want from our students and young people for the next generation, because we are going to be rebuilding not just our country and the economy, but our society and our on a global scale as well. And so we have to be thinking about, what do we want? The qualification system, as we know, is not working and wasn't working, and as that has been exposed, and we have to think about the impact that has had on the ideas and the futures of our young people. But we also need to think of a national curriculum for all. And I know Scotland has got a lot of kind of press for the LGBTI curriculum, but we actually have to think about what does that look like when it's been kind of put in place? What resources does it need? What training and support do our colleagues need? Because it has to actually be implemented. And that's the problem, is we have a number of initiatives announced, but they need to be implemented. I've got 10 seconds left, and I couldn't finish without saying, we have to definitely take on board decolonising the curriculum. The University of Glasgow has done some fantastic work, but we've got to trickle that down into schools to make sure that all of our children and young people see themselves in education. So I'm going to end there. The only thing I'm going to say is we have to make sure that we are trusting the profession, empowering teachers, and reshaping an education system that has learned from a global pandemic and prepares our young people for the world that is going to be heading our way very, very soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Michelle. A lot of very good points made, and I'm looking forward to expanding on them and then having that debate as we go in the next hour. I'll now invite Barry Black to come on and give his 5 minutes. Barry is currently undertaking a PhD in widening educational inequality and the narrowing of curriculum opportunity in Scottish education. Barry's research into the SQA downgrading of marks in September was instrumental in exposing the extent of unfairness and forcing the Scottish Government U-turn. Barry has care experience growing up in kinship care in Aberdeen, and he's also standing for election in 2021. And if elected, he would be the first care experienced MSP. So I'll let Barry have his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you to colleagues for coming along to listen to us all this afternoon. Thanks as well to the Fabian Society and the Scottish Young Fabians for putting on this event. I think throughout their history until now, the Fabian Society has really been a platform and an amplifier for progressive ideas in education. And it's great to see that continuing right through the current pandemic. And when I thought about what I was going to say on this panel in terms of opening remarks today, I thought about how I could give a sort of Scottish perspective and how policy around education has sort of transpired during the pandemic. But to be honest, there's been so little difference between the SNP government's approach to education with the Tories in Westminster that much of what I'll talk about here will be recognisable to English colleagues as well, in terms of how exams have been treated, how online learning has been treated, and how teachers and school staff have been treated throughout this as well. And I think just to restate what Michelle said in her opening remarks there, that really what we've seen during the pandemic isn't the opening up of new inequalities, but really just the exacerbation of the existing ones. A lack of funding that has gone into schools, the size of our attainment gap, the digital connectivity and how that impacts on different people of different socio-economic backgrounds, for example, haven't became an issue because of the pandemic, but merely been highlighted for the issues that they are. And when we think about how activism can change things in terms of education, I think we have to reflect on really it's the only thing that ever has, and that has certainly been the case over the past year as well. So I want to talk about firstly about exams and qualifications, and then online learning, and talk a bit about activism. Eva, who I know quite well, will be bored of me talking about the SQA downgrading scandal, but I'm going to go over it slightly more as well. Similar to as in England, the Scottish Government and the SQA, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, who looks after our exams and qualifications, decided to use statistical moderation to moderate teacher estimates for grades in the summer just past, because of the school shutdown, meant that exams couldn't take place. But what they did is they based this methodology wholly on the prior attainment of schools and nothing to do with the individual performance of pupils. And clearly what this means is, because of how educational inequality shows itself, the schools in the most deprived areas of Scotland had worse prior attainment, meaning that individuals based on their postcode had their grades downgraded by a tune of about over double those in the most affluent schools. And for a week, the Scottish Government defended this position through, many lines of spin and statistics that they could feed out of the moderation process. And I was proud that it was in part my work interrogating the moderation system, showing these inequalities, that, was in part what led to the change and the U-turn. And what I believe it happening a week before in Scotland made Gavin Williamson and the Tories think again about whether they would carry on with the exact same approach. But really, it was the young people that took this information, took this unfairness, and took to the streets of Glasgow and other cities in Scotland and put pressure on the Education Secretary and the government and the SQA to change this tack and accept teacher estimates, which happened in the end. And it was only because young people decided not to accept this unfairness, see that their life chances were on the line because of administrative decision that was taken months before in order to change this system. Secondly, on online learning, I think what we've seen, and it still astounds me really that we're in this position where there's been a second school lockdown, and it's almost as if it's came out of nowhere. Since spring, we have known that there was going to be the possibility that there would be another school shutdown, and very little in Scotland has been done to ensure that the infrastructure and the resources were there. I think in England, slightly better with the likes of Oak National, although there is problems, there is an online curriculum that's accessible, and in Scotland, we've really been behind the mark. But I know I'm running out of time, but just one last thing to say, and I think it's the job of the Labour Party and the Labour movement to amplify progressive activism, like the young people in the SQA that I talked about. In Scotland, we've seen a large amount of activism come from some sections of our society, which has been quite anti-teacher, which is, said that, schools are safe, that, schools should be back full time. And that's activism, I think, not for a progressive cause. And I think the National Education Union keeps, not at all costs, make schools safe campaign was a really progressive and positive antidote to that. So activism has only ever been the thing that has changed things in education, but it's the role of us, the unions and the Labour Party, to ensure it's progressive activism that is amplified and is actually running the general debate around education. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Barry. And I think you've been presenting some of those, bold alternatives that I mentioned in the intro, and hopefully you'll get a chance to speak more about them, like things like scrapping the SQA if you actually make it to Holyrood. So I'm looking forward to having that discussion too. I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Wes Streeting. Wes is a Labour MP for Aylesford North and Shadow Minister for Schools. Wes bucked the trend to win the seat from the Conservatives in the 2015 general election and subsequently won again with a significantly increased majority in 2017. In his professional life, he's worked outside politics as a senior manager and a chief executive for a number of voluntary and private sector organisations working to tackle educational disadvantage. Wes's passion for education arises from his own experience, growing up in a council estate in Tower Hamlets to become the first person in his family to go to university. He's one of the few pupils who have received free school meals to make it to Cambridge University, where he read history at Selwyn College and became president of Cambridge University Students' Union. Wes is a former president of the National Union of Students. So I'll invite Wes to give us 5 minutes.
Thanks, Ava, and thanks everyone for coming along this morning, and thanks to the Fabian Society for putting on such a fantastic conference, and to the Scottish Young Fabians for hosting this really important Fringe. It's great to be joined by other experts. I hope Amanda Martin might be able to get onto the call shortly too, because there's been a huge amount of really quite remarkable education activism in recent months, and we're going to need more of this in the coming years in the run up to a crucial set of elections in May, particularly in Scotland, and Wales, as well as right across England, and of course a general election where there's one overriding message is that education does better when there's a Labour government that actually believes in education and understands the role of education in transforming people's life chances and opportunities. And that's really what we're fighting for. It's also great, by the way, to be on a panel with Michelle Codrington, who is Rogers, who I said before we started. I first met Michelle on a bus from NUS conference down to London to fight, sadly at the time, a Labour government introducing top-up fees. So yeah, I've got a long track record of education activism as well. Actually, at the centre of my first election campaign and subsequent election campaigns, we drew really heavily on school cuts campaigning and the impact that school cuts were having on schools in my community and so many others across the country. And I hope that the next election will be able to do two things, not just campaign against the Tories and the damaging cuts that they've inflicted on our education, and indeed the SNP up in Scotland, whose educational record is absolutely woeful, but also to present a more positive, optimistic future for schools in our country, which is about fair funding, a really good, strong, rich curriculum, and an assessment system that really measures the potential and achievement of pupils and gives children from every background a fair chance. What we've seen during the course of this pandemic is educational inequality writ large. We went into this pandemic with the educational attainment gap widening. That's not just true of government under the Tories. Shamefully, it's also the SNP's record. And there's one way to wind up the SNP in Westminster, it's to take them on their own record on education in Scotland, their record on child poverty. I'm afraid there really isn't much between the SNP and the Tories, however much they hate the comparison. And of course come from different nationalist political traditions, but nonetheless there really isn't much that separates the SNP and the Tories on education. So I'm glad that we're having this meeting under the auspices of the Scottish Young Fabians. And during the course of the pandemic, we've seen so many reasons why that attainment gap is widening, entrenched by the government's response to the pandemic. The failure to fund schools adequately, particularly to meet the extra funding pressures of school safety, the need to get in support staff because teachers are off self-isolating, and indeed their support staff too. The fact that schools are actually understaffed compared to what they were because we've lost headcount over the last 10 years of cuts, including the crucial role played by support staff in schools, not just teaching staff. And the fact that the digital divide has been reinforced by a failure to provide kids with the laptops they need, with the internet they need. Across England, there are 1.8 million children who lack access to a device at home. And even if the government meets its target of getting 1.3 million laptops out, that's still 500,000 children going without. So even the summit of the government's ambitions fall well short of what's needed. The failure to provide free school meals and to repeat the same mistakes again and again and again, culminating in those horrifying photos we saw last week, which weren't just terrible because of the stinginess of caterers who thought that was acceptable for any child, but also horrifying because it only just fell short of the standard that the government set for the caterers, in cahoots with the caterers, I should add too. The failure we saw last summer of the exams where, I genuinely can't imagine any Labour Education Secretary being presented with evidence that working class kids were being disproportionately affected by downgrading and wouldn't just stop the system in their tracks there and say, we're going to need a different approach. But actually Gavin Williamson in Westminster, Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland, they allowed the system to roll on until it was called out by campaigners and the brilliant work done by Barry and others to expose the injustice. Absolutely outrageous. None of this was inevitable. This is the consequence of poor political choices, and it's up to us to make sure that we have a Labour government in every part of the United Kingdom after the next set of elections. We've got to make sure that we've got a government that once again is focused on every child mattering, that makes sure that we have a focus on narrowing the attainment gap, that funds schools, because if we invest early in children's education, we know that that deals dividends, not just for their own life chances, but also in terms of tackling all sorts of poverties and injustices in our society that end up costing us more collectively on every level. We've got to make sure we've got an assessment system that is fairer and doesn't just rely on high stakes exams. We've got to make sure we've got a curriculum that reflects the diversity of our society and tells the truth about the country and who we are and where we've come from and most importantly, helps children and young people to paint a picture of who they want to be and the kind of society they want to grow up in. So there's lots for us to get our teeth into. I know how much education matters from my own personal experience, but I also know that education is one of the biggest issues that matters to every Labour Party member. So I'm looking forward to working with you, the Labour membership, the Fabian membership, experts and professionals across the trade union movement and across the teaching and support staff professions, to make sure that by the time we get to the next set of elections, we've got a Labour manifesto that genuinely inspires and offers not just hope, but a path to a better future for everyone across our country.
Thanks for that, Wes. And I think especially as Scottish Fabians, it's so refreshing to hear, you know, how we have to have that fight across, and having the solidarity from, you know, MPs down south and Holyrood is so important for us going forward, and putting that manifesto forward wherever it may be, if it's the Holyrood elections or the next Westminster elections. And so thank you so much for that. And again, looking forward to having further discussion in the time we have left. And we're still trying to get Amanda Martin onto the call. So once we get her on, I'll invite her to give her 5 minutes. But I'll start off. We have a question from Sanchia Alasia, and I think Kath's trying to see if she's able to come on and ask her question herself. So I'll give her a couple of seconds to see if she's able to join us and ask herself. If not, I'm happy to read it out. But Sanchia, if you're able to. Oh, there we go. There's Sanchia.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I posted a question about the future of our young people, because their education has been disrupted now for quite some time. I don't have kids of my own, but my nieces and nephews, my sisters, have been talking to me about how worried they are about their children's futures, particularly the ones on the older side. So I'm just wondering, from Michelle's perspective, from the union, and from Wes and Barry, what sort of things do you think we should be advocating for? I recognise that Michelle was saying we shouldn't go back to a broken system. So what sort of things should we, as trade unionists and Labour Party activists, be pushing for, so that, you know, our children will be able to access opportunities and fulfil their potential in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I'll bring in Michelle first, and see if you want to answer that one, then I'll just go around the panel.
Thank you, Sancho, and that's a really good place to start, because for me, we need a recovery plan that has got the investment, not just of key stakeholders, but also financial investment as well. And I think that's absolutely at the core of it. And it's about how that investment can be used. I've just put in the chat the NASUWT kind of guide to what we need to be demanding to kind of rebuild our education system, because that's essentially what we need to do. It needs to go into recovery mode. And this morning, Dominic Raab on Andrew Marr was kind of announcing the vaccination roadmap, and he was really proud of it, and it was very public, and this is what they've committed to. I'm not understanding why we haven't got one of those for education. You know, we know what the problems are going to be when we come out of it. We want a roadmap that is driven by the profession, it's driven by stakeholders, it's not just driven by politicians sitting in a room on their own kind of coming up with what they think education is about, but it needs to be something that is invested in widely, and we need to give that empowerment to our profession, but also to the pedagogists, the academics, the people who know what education is about and how it's delivered. And we need to have a roadmap that is very clearly public, that everybody can buy into, and that we can have parents and children and young people invested in as well. So it's a very wide kind of answer there, Sanchia, because there's so many moving parts, but we have to make sure that children and young people are at the heart of it, without being at the expense of teachers and teachers' well-being and their rights as employees, because workload is what is going to push out a lot of experience. We're already seeing it during the pandemic, that many of our colleagues are handing in their notice because they don't feel that their well-being and their professionalism is being respected, but not just by the government, but by wider society as well.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Barry, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think particularly there's two strands to that. There's how do we build back better within the education system for the young people still to kind of go through, and there's how do we, ensure there's a pathway to a positive future for the young people who've particularly been affected during the pandemic. So on the first point, I think, as Michelle says, investment in our classrooms is key. In Scotland in 2010, we introduced a new curriculum. So that's 11 years ago. And this year, compared to 11 years ago, budgets in schools are £400 million lower. So we've had a major time of disruptive, positive change within the curriculum in Scotland, but at a time of harsh austerity. And it just demonstrably hasn't delivered the curriculum which we wished it to. So investment in schools, in classrooms and teaching staff is absolutely core to that building back better idea. As well as that is ensuring much more work is done on addressing a digital divide and ensuring that there's a platform there for actual engaging, proper, coherent, structured online learning. I think that's absolutely key. And as well, I think now we're at the stage where we're moving towards a change in how we assess young people, how we actually award qualifications, but we'll perhaps get to that a bit later in the panel. As for the young people who've been affected now during the pandemic, already so badly let down with their exam results last year, as I say, and every indication that there's going to be another shambles in exam results next year. We need to do a lot with the further and higher education institutions to ensure that the places and the pathways are there. In Scotland anyway, I'm not sure about England, we've seen the pandemic really disrupt the amount of modern apprenticeships that are available. So we need investment to ensure that businesses are still able to take on apprenticeships, whether they're just out of school or graduates. And as well, I think we need to be looking at something like a young people's jobs guarantee to ensure that we don't see a huge rise in youth unemployment, because we know that there's going to be an economic sort of crisis coming, and it's young people and women particularly who get affected anytime there's sort of major economic disruption. So I think there's the two strands of how do we sort, recovery in the education system, but there's 2-3 years of senior pupils that have really been let down by this pandemic, and we need to ensure that there's a positive pathway for them.
Thanks, Barry. And Wes, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said about the need for a national education recovery, and I think that's got to have all sorts of kind of support built in, recognising that we've got two missions here. One is to narrow the gap in attainment and to reduce the inequality and disadvantage between children and young people from the most advantaged backgrounds and the least advantaged backgrounds, but also recognising, by the way, that very few kids have had a good time during this pandemic, and that even where you've got families who are pretty comfortable and well off, this has been a really challenging time. And I think we should be thinking about this recovery both in terms of education, but also the health and well-being of children and young people, and recognising that we've got a mental health crisis on our hands, and we've got a system of mental health support in our country which is not equipped to support children and young people in the best of times, let alone these most challenging times. And then thinking sort of a bit beyond that and towards the next election and the sorts of things that Labour ought to be thinking about in terms of our manifesto. There is an obvious link, although I laugh when I say obvious, because I don't think it's obvious to governments north or south of the border, between poverty and educational disadvantage. And although we rightly demand the very best and the excellence in terms of what goes on within the school gates, and we ask a lot of the school's workforce to get the best out of children and young people, we've got to recognise that they can only do so much while the conditions beyond the school gates are so dire. So we have to go back to having a plan to end child poverty, and a really ambitious plan to end child poverty. And that's why Keir Starmer, not long after he was elected leader, set up a subcommittee of the shadow cabinet, led by Kate Green, which brings together different teams across the front bench to recognise that if we're serious about improving life chances and opportunities for children and young people, that's not just about education, it's about housing, employment, connectivity, the wider economy. And so you can expect Labour to have that kind of big, bold vision on tackling poverty and inequality beyond the school gates to give kids a better chance of succeeding within the school gates. The second thing, and it ties into what Michelle was saying there, if we're serious about this being the best place in the world for a child to grow up, as Keir said, this has to be the best place in the world to be a teacher. If we get the very best out of the school's workforce, they will get the very best out of their kids. And I think it's criminal, actually, that, you know, there's rightly a focus on initial teacher training, and we can't be complacent about recruiting and retaining the very best people into the school's workforce. But we also need to invest in their ongoing professional training and development. You know, you don't become an oven-ready teacher after 2 years. It's a constant journey, and we have to make sure that school staff, both teaching and support staff, can constantly update their professional knowledge and also share what they've learned with their peers. And that brings me on to the third point, really, and it's a question that's still very live in my mind. And, you know, I've got lots of strong views about education, so I have to try and remind myself not to necessarily kind of project my own assumptions onto a system that actually has a wealth of data and evidence available and expertise that we should draw on. So one of the questions for me is, in terms of some of the big issues like the curriculum, what we teach, how we teach, where do those decisions best sit? Is it really with an education secretary who changes every 5 minutes in Westminster? Or is it with the profession? And how do we put more trust and support in the profession? And then where do we bring in democratic accountability? And I don't just mean democratic accountability from Whitehall or Holyrood or Cardiff Bay. I mean local communities as well. I think everyone I've been speaking to, whether local authority schools or multi-academy trusts in England, recognise that the dual system we have in England of academy schools over here and local authority schools over here isn't really working. So how do we unify the school system again, drawing on the best of what we have, evolving the current system, but also restoring some democratic accountability so that local decision makers, whether elected representatives like councillors, but also, frankly, parents themselves and pupils themselves have a voice and a say over education and are involved in that conversation about how we get the best out of our local schools. So those are quite big questions for us to answer, and debates no doubt will be running with. But I really think those three things, tackling poverty outside the school gates, investing in our teaching profession so it's the best in the world, and also thinking about where decisions best sit and how we restore some democratic accountability. I think that would put us on the right path to having a genuinely world-leading education system.
Thanks, Wes, and it's great to see a number of people in the chat agreeing with the points that you've all made, and I think Sanchia as well said that she was really grateful for the comprehensive answers. I'm going to go to Albie Mills next and give him a couple of seconds to come on and ask. I see he's got a question.
Hi guys, so I'm Albie, I'm chair of the Young Scottish Fabians, and thank you all for turning up today and giving such a great talk, and thanks to Eva as well, who's a real pro at this. I just wanted to which was, it's sort of given that Holyrood's such a large part, government education, sorry, is such a large part of Holyrood's brief, and we've seen this year how important it is along with health. They're the sort of the two public, most public areas of policy that have been developed. I mean, the SQA, I was really wanted to know how we hold the Scottish Government to account on education policy, because the SQA protest felt like a unique moment of activism against policy specific to Holyrood, and also I think John Swinney's kind of unique in the sense that he's a unique figure for criticism in the government, and just sort of how many people in Scotland know that education has devolved, or at least how much education policy has devolved, and how easy is it, and how can we in the future hold the SNP to account over education policy?
Thanks, Albie, and can I thank Albie for all the work he continues to do as chair of Scottish Young Fabians, and he's brought me in and Barry as well to a number of discussions, so he's really grateful for the work he continues to do. I'll go to Barry first on that, and then I'll go around the panel and see what people think.
Cheers, guys.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You can send me and Eva to Holyrood, which would begin, I think, to solve a lot of that problems. But no, it's a good question. And I think that the SQA, debacle, shambles, whatever you want to call it, and the continuing sort of problems that we've seen in education throughout the pandemic really has you know, brought education policy to the heart of the national debate in Scotland and across the UK as well. I think there's a very high sort of level of engagement with where education sits, how education sits within Holyrood, and I think real scrutiny is coming into, you know, how education policy is actually impacting families. Because to start with around exams, everybody's either sat exams or has kids in either theirs or in their family who are affected and can see the injustice of that. And now that we've got an online learning again, schooling from home, you know, there's a direct impact on families and how families can operate through homeschooling. So there's a huge, I think, magnifying glass almost on education policy at the moment. How do we hold it more to account? As I think to you know, real rigorous research to actually be able to actually highlight directly what the problems are that can get behind sort of political spin and rhetoric that we often see in education, to actually highlight what the problems is and work with the unions, particularly, you know, whose membership are clearly being the most affected, I think, section of public sector workers, you know, perhaps after health, but in terms of how poorly they've been treated in terms of working conditions throughout this, and the sort of huge engagement we've seen from parents groups. And that's not always, as I said at the start, for the progressive activism that we wish to see, but we have to sort of understand concerns and make progressive change from that. So I think there's a huge appetite for change in education policy. There's a huge amount of public scrutiny of education policy now, and Labour have to be the people who are, you know, situated with the ideas and the answers of how that actually changes.
Thanks, Barry. I'll bring in Wes. You're on mute, Wes.
Happens to us at least once a day, doesn't it? We should know by now after this long. Look, far be it for me to give advice to the Scottish Labour Party, because I think they've got a big and hard challenge, and sort of people poking in their noses from down south doesn't always help. But I just sort of make a few observations really on this. The first is that education absolutely should be a priority for the Scottish Labour going into May's elections, partly because education should always be a priority for Labour for all of the reasons we believe, and I think education is so fundamental to who we are and what we stand for as a political party. But second, because the SNP's record is just so woeful. There are fewer teachers now in Scotland than there were when the SNP came to power in 2007. The education attainment gap between the richest and poorest students is widening. And when you, take just one factor into consideration, and that's the educational outcomes for looked after children in Scotland, where the state literally has a role as a corporate parent for those children. And you think about what parents want for their children and what they're willing to do for their children, and then think about what the SNP government as a corporate parent has done for the children of Scotland. 39% of looked after children in Scotland had one or more National 5 qualifications. That's compared to 86% for all children across Scotland. I mean, that is a record that any parent should be ashamed of. And you know, and this is the sort of the outcome and the result of the SNP's education policy. So I think we've got to go really hard on the attack, have some clear alternatives. And actually, because one thing that really drives me up the wall about the SNP down in Westminster, they are so good at passing the buck. They are so good at passing the buck. They do grievance and criticism, you know, and passing the buck unlike any other political force I think I've ever seen. If something's going wrong, it's the fault of Westminster. If something's going right, it must be Nicola Sturgeon and her government. And the fact is that the SNP have responsibility for education. They have plenty of powers and scope for education in Scotland, and their record is woeful. This is on Nicola Sturgeon's watch, not anyone else's. And frankly, even if Scotland were a separate country, they would still be saddled with this miserable record on education. And I think we sometimes, I think sometimes we get drawn in too easily and too willingly to the SNP's constitutional traps. They love talking about independence. It is their reason for being, but it is not in the top 10 list of things that people in Scotland are currently worrying about. So we've got to stick to the issues that people are really caring about, focus on people's everyday lives. Education's top of the list. We've got a vision. The SNP's record is shameful, and we should tear them apart on it.
Thanks for that, Wes. And I think that's something sometimes we forget, that independence isn't a priority for Scottish people. We've seen it in polls that have came out, and education is far higher than, I mean, the SNP say time and time again that education will be their priority, and they've ultimately failed. And I think it's important that we try and highlight that at every opportunity. Michelle, I'll bring you in.
I hope I'm unmuted now. I'm just going to say, as teachers, the mute button is the best thing that's ever been invented. So I really appreciate the mute button. The fact of the matter is, and I think my colleagues in Scotland would hate for me not to highlight this issue, is the Scottish Government have to talk to all of the unions that represent teachers, and not just pick and choose which unions they want to consult with and to get the answers that they want. NASUWT, our membership in Scotland is growing every single month. Our membership is growing, and we speak on behalf of teachers. We are not a general union. We speak on behalf of teachers, and that's something we're really proud of. And I'm really glad that, Barry, you talked about research and kind of that, underpinning the evidence of kind of what needs to happen, because you mentioned in your contribution around the change to the curriculum. And I know we've got devolved nations that are listening and watching and learning from each other. The national curriculum, or the curriculum change in Scotland, the Curriculum for Excellence, I think it's called, has been picked up in Wales. And the mistakes that were made in Scotland are now being transferred to Wales. And so it's absolutely crucial that, although we're talking about devolved nations and individual ministers, actually, as a trade union, from our perspective, we know what's happening in different parts of the country, and so actually talking to us is the absolute first step, and actually learning from each other as well, and making sure that we're able to contribute to that research and to that evidence, so it is evidence-based. I can't contribute. I can't. I guess. Reflect on which party is better or worse, because NASUWT will work with whoever's got the best interest of education for children and young people. But we can't just expect a new curriculum or changes to be brought in without listening to the impact it has on teachers' workload, and making sure that teachers are reflected. And one of the things I want to pick up on in relation to this is making sure you've got a diverse workforce. I think it was a couple of years ago, and I'm looking at Barry, a couple of years ago, there wasn't one Black or minority ethnic head teacher in the whole of Scotland. What is that saying to our children and young people? If that's not a priority as well, about making sure we've got a diverse, reflective workforce, then that has to be part of the conversation as well.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Really important points made again. I think we could have a discussion just on that question basically for the full hour, because it brings out so much, especially going forward to this year's elections. I've got a question here from Catriona Monroe, so I'll give Catriona a couple of seconds to come on and ask the question. Are you able to get on, Catriona? Maybe there's been some difficulty there. Catriona Monroe asks, in the discussion about exams, it seems to be assumed that exams are the best way of addressing young people, yet for assessing, many exams are stressful and force students to learn just to get through the exams instead of assessing skills. Surely we should be thinking about how to assess young people's skills more effectively and building back better and differently. And I'll go to Wes first on that one.
Thanks very much for that question from my fellow vice chair of the Fabian Society. I think there's definitely a debate to be had about how we best do assessment. I think we took some people by surprise when we said sort of late last year that we felt that it was in the best interests of students across the country for exams to go ahead, and that the government should come up with a plan that enabled that to happen with some mitigations and adjustments in place to recognise that there was differential lost learning across the country, particularly for students who'd lost out on the most learning as a result of self-isolating and bubbles and that kind of thing. And the reason we said that is the grass isn't always greener on the other side. And I think there is actually a debate to be had about how we do assessment in the broadest of terms. I think we can definitely see some of the advantages that the Welsh Labour government has had over Westminster, because they didn't do away with all of the modular examinations and coursework. So there's a wider basis of evidence from which to draw some conclusions about pupils' attainment. But moving straight over us, we may unfortunately be about to find, moving straight over to teacher assessment also comes with some challenges, particularly if it's done in a hurried way and isn't done well. The first is, we saw last year that turning schools into individual assessment centres effectively and awarding bodies can put a hell of a lot of pressure on teachers. And before you know it, angry parents start turning up demanding to know why sort of little Johnny and Jemima didn't get the top grades that mummy and daddy expected for them. And that can be really, really awful for staff. We know that there is also a risk of building in bias, often unconscious bias, but bias nonetheless, which can have a disproportionate impact on children from a range of underrepresented backgrounds, but particularly baking in racial disadvantage. So I think we've got to be really careful about this. You know, but I think I speak for myself and Kate, we're open-minded about what the future of assessment looks like. We just want to tread really carefully on this to make sure that any system that we come up with the best of intentions doesn't also lead to some unintended consequences and baking in inequality. So certainly an area which is ripe for reform, I would argue, but one where I think we've got to follow the evidence, tread carefully, and not rush to any judgments about what the future of assessment should look like under a Labour government.
Thanks, Wes. And I'll go to Michelle.
I think that has to be the message, which is tread carefully. As a citizenship teacher, when they announced how are we going to possibly assess children and young people, I sat there and I just thought, imagine if we still had coursework that we could then refer back to. I mean, imagine we had a system where we could look at the modular achievements of children and young people, and they were scrapped. They were scrapped when, you know, this is a time when we're actually thinking, what were we doing right in the past that would have helped us out of this situation now, and how could we make it better? It's important to recognise the pressure on teachers. Since we went back in September, back into face-to-face teaching, schools have been preparing for this circumstance without knowing what it was going to look like. And the workload and expectation on our colleagues to be assessing, almost in some cases, almost every day, they were assessing students and young people. So they had a bank of evidence to refer back to without knowing what was actually going to be used or needed, means that we have to make sure that our teachers and our colleagues aren't being put under unbelievable pressure to have to prove something that a system doesn't recognise our professional judgment in the first place. And I'm glad you mentioned about bias, Wes, because that's really crucial, because we have to remember the qualifications and exam system doesn't work for every student already, let alone kind of thinking about how to reinvent the wheel on the head of a pin again. The qualifications system needs to reflect what we want children and young people to be assessed in, and that's where we have to really go back to the experts, and we have to design a system that actually reflects what we need. But bias is something that we do have to be really conscious of, because bias already exists in the system as it is, and we don't want to exacerbate it.
Thanks, Michelle, and I'll bring in Barry.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's one of the core ones that we're going to be looking at as we sort of go forward and sort of recover out of this pandemic. If you asked me 2 years ago about this question about exams and assessment, I would have said that the system that we have of high stakes exams perhaps is a great equaliser. But following my PhD research in the senior phase of Scottish schools, which broadly relates to a sixth form in England, looking at pathways and curriculum opportunity, I now don't believe that's the case. I think our high stakes exam system, strangles innovation in the senior phase and closes down other holistic pathways in terms of vocational education and other educational experiences. I think the system that we ended up with last year with purely teacher assessment also isn't one that we would have designed from the start. So I don't think that's the complete route to go down in terms of, just relying on teachers' assessment. I think it has to be a mix teacher judgment, continuous assessment, and exams part of that mix as well, but perhaps just not the high stakes 2-hour exam that we understand it to be at the moment. In Scotland, the OECD is currently carrying out a review into the curriculum for excellence, and part of that, they will review Scottish assessment and Scottish qualifications. So after the Holyrood elections, when it reports, it's perhaps going to be a ripe time for us to look at reforming how we actually deal with these things in Scotland. And one of the things I've put forward, I'm currently in a selection race to be a candidate for Scottish Labour in the northeast of Scotland, is a bill to scrap the Scottish Qualifications Authority and replace it with a new qualifications body which better reflects the holistic intentions of our curriculum. I think the SQA has lost trust, lost confidence of the teaching profession, young people and families. And I don't think, given its history of being a pure exams body, that it is the right organisation to take forward a reform of looking at how we more holistically assess young people for their qualifications. I think the mood music on this question is moving away from exams towards more holistic assessment amongst educationalists, perhaps amongst teachers. But as Wes rightly says, I think it is up to us, if we go down this route, that we have to take parents and employers with us on that as well. A lot of people still view a senior A-level or higher exam as the golden ticket, and we're going to have to take people with us if we're going to convincingly make an argument that we can have robust, holistic assessment for our qualifications.
Thanks for that, Barry. We've got time for one more question, I think. So I see, 2 seconds. I see James Short has a couple of questions, but one specifically around hire. So I'll invite James to come on and ask that if he's able to. Not sure if he's able to get on, but he's asked, is there a failure when hires are more compelling than what we have in England, Wales and Northern Ireland? So I suppose it goes back to a bit of what Barry had said there about hires being the golden ticket, as well as how that kind of translates across other parts of the UK. So I'll bring in Barry for that one first.
Yeah, I think it follows on from what I just said in that last question as well. We still need a sort of senior qualification that is robust, that employers, colleges, universities can look at and assess, how young people have done and the competencies that they have for whatever they want to go on and do. Part of the issue in that strangling of innovation that I talked about is that in Scotland, the idea is that our 4th, 5th and 6th year, so the last 3 years of school, is supposed to be a flexible senior phase that you can develop throughout and, dip in and out of different subjects and things like this. But the problem is that the existence of the higher in its current state is that universities, for example, still demand 5 hires equivalent to sort of A-levels within 1 year. So it strips out all of that pretense that 3-year block can actually be a flexible, fluid, holistic sort of period, because the rest of society still demands this golden ticket idea of 5 hires within 1 year. And until we can start to move beyond that, but still assess in a robust way, of course, we will be stuck in this limbo where it's almost a 2-tier system between kids, predominantly middle-class families that will do 5 hires and go to university, and then a kind of holistic, vocational curriculum for the rest. I don't think we will have achieved in Scottish education what we have set out to achieve until a middle-class young person destined for university decides that doing vocational education and into a modern apprenticeship is a viable alternative. And until families and young people see that as an option, we won't have achieved what we've actually tried to achieve with our curriculum.
Thanks for that, Barry, and I'll bring in Wes.
Yeah, I strongly agree with what Barry's just said there. So strongly. I really think of one of the big mistakes of the last Labour government, which otherwise had with 1 or 2 notable exceptions, which I campaigned against at the time, had a really fantastic record on education. One big mistake, I think, was the failure to let 14 to 19 curriculum reform slip through its fingers. And there was a brilliant report produced by Mike Tomlinson, which had this kind of vision for mixing different routes and pathways across the 14 to 19 period, with a view to giving young people that opportunity to experience different routes, to have high quality vocational routes, not just the kind of traditional, A levels and off to university route. I don't think you can just kind of stick it in the microwave, reheat it, and kind of present it as the vision for the next Labour government. A lot has moved on, but I would like us to return to that kind of approach of how because this is part of the problem with a system that is only about preparing you for the next set of examinations. You've got to have a system that enables young people to experiment and experience a range of different subjects, opportunities, and to work out who they are, what they want to be, and what they enjoy. And I mean, for some children and young people from the most advantaged backgrounds, they get those opportunities all the time, in the school holidays, at the weekends, in the evenings. They're constantly exposed to all sorts of different activities and opportunities, and people from different backgrounds able to broaden their horizons and open their eyes to possibilities they may not have even contemplated. And when you're from a more working class background, it's not that your parents are any less ambitious for you. And I hate the idea that middle class is an aspirational thing and working class families don't have aspiration. It's a load of crap. But what we do sometimes lack is the same kind of horizons open to us, the same sorts of opportunities and the same doors open to us. And I think that's what we've got to try and fundamentally change. So and that's what I'm interested in exploring. And I also take up Michael's challenge in the comments there about exams and assessments. As I said, we've got to tread carefully, but I do recognise that there is an opening at the moment. There is a space opening up for a debate about assessment, and we might not want to miss the boat on that. And I'll also take on board the exhortations in the chat as well to dust off Tomlinson and have another look at that too. But thanks very much. And I think we'll be, as we're approaching the end, I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been really brilliant, and it makes me feel optimistic about the future of the Scottish Labour Party, as well as the Labour Party across the rest of the UK.
Thanks for that, Wes. I'll bring in Michelle.
Mute. There we go. Thank you. And to pick up on that, Wes, because that education has to be lifelong, and unfortunately we're losing it, and we have to make sure that children see that. And as a fellow free school meal kid who grew up in not the leafy aspirational kind of rich part of Oxford, I had a goal to be a lorry driver. That's what I wanted to be, a long distance lorry driver. And I had the opportunity to do both A levels and a BTEC, and I that opportunity to find what I enjoyed helped shape my path of where I wanted to go and where I wanted to be. I mean, I'm glad I didn't become a long distance lorry driver, because I would have been sat on a motorway in Kent probably at this point. But I think we have to create that space where children and young people can find what it is that interests them, because education has to be about enjoyment, but also about being able to find what your interests are. So I've really, really enjoyed this discussion today. And I'm going to do a quick plug and just say, please support our campaign, Vaccinate to Educate. It's all over Twitter. We're trying to put pressure to make sure that teachers and school staff are added to the priority list, to make sure if we want to keep schools open and keep schools safe, we need to make sure that we're ensuring that we're up on that priority list. So thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed being on this panel.
Thanks, Michelle. And if I'll be still on the call, maybe we could get something out on Twitter about that campaign that you mentioned there on the Young Scottish Fabians Twitter account. But thank you again for all joining us. I'd like to thank our excellent panel for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Michelle, Barry, and Wes. Sorry we weren't able to sort the technical difficulties. It would have been great to have the views of the NUU, but you can still follow Amanda on Twitter to keep up with her work. And I've been told that Scottish Fabians are planning to do a standalone event with her in the future, so please look out for that one. Thank you all for joining us too, for submitting questions and contributing. It's clear young people, teachers and staff are being failed by both Westminster and Holyrood and across the UK. So there's work we can do and work we can and should be doing across the UK to improve education. I'm certain all those in the panel and those tuned in today have a huge part to play in that. And finally, I'd like to mention that the Young Scottish Fabians are launching their first pamphlet, Devolutionary Theory, on how Scottish Labour can use innovative local government policy in 2021 and 2022. I was honoured to write the foreword for the pamphlet, and it's full of great policy recommendations on housing, transport, the economy, and much more. And the pamphlet will be launched at the Young Fabians AGM on the 2nd of February at 7 o'clock, where they'll also be looking for new executive members. So for further details, follow @ScotlandYF on Twitter or email albie@scotland@youngfabians.org.uk. So the Scottish Fabians will continue to formulate policy through discussion and debate. So please do get involved in that, especially in the run-up to this year's Holyrood election. The last thing for me to say is a thank you again, and I don't even have to say safe travels home because everyone's in their home. So just please enjoy the rest of your weekend. So thank you again to everyone who joined, and thank you to our excellent panel. It's been a fantastic discussion.